Hey, this is Davin with Hagerty and Redline Rebuild Updates. Back on the Cadillac, or maybe I should say still on the Cadillac. As you know from the last episode, we wrapped up our short block. It's all set. It is ready for a set of heads and the manifold and to be finished up. However, the heads are off to paint. I'm waiting for that paint to dry. So in the meantime, I'm putting my time to use and I'm gonna go through and clean up the fuel pump. So today I'm gonna disassemble this fuel pump and actually put it in our tumbler, clean it up overnight, and then go through and put the rebuild kit in the morning. So that's what I'm doing. Bada boom, bada bing. One of the most useful things new in the toolbox, as far as I'm concerned, is a cell phone, and it's not to play music, and it's not to look up stuff on Google. It is to take photos of how things are coming apart. So as I take stuff apart, I take some pictures. So for instance, on this fuel pump, just in case this hole and that hole are the same size, I want to make sure that I know which one went in which end. So basically this style with all the holes goes to the left by the inlet, and the style that really looks like it only has 4 holes goes towards the outlet. Now certainly if I'm going to do this right away tomorrow morning, my memory is probably going to be good enough that I can remember how this goes back together tomorrow. Or if I set my parts out like I always do and have, you know, this one over here and this one over here, and I leave this part in this spot, basically draw myself a picture, then I'm pretty good chance I'll be fine. But if you get waylaid by chance, you know, and come back 6 months later, you're probably not going to have that stuff on the table anymore. Or if nothing else, someone's probably helped you move things around and reorganize. So good idea to have a photo of it. I mean, even you can draw a picture, of course, but a photo's pretty quick. All right, so everything's all apart. I'm going to take and polish up the brass pieces. And basically, whoops, the 3 external pieces. They're aluminum. They'll actually polish up quite nice, or clean, if you will, without just running them through the normal parts washer, which you certainly could. You could run carb cleaner on them or brake clean just to get the gunk off. But I'm going to go just a little bit further and use our Rebel tumbler here that has these little, if you recall, it utilizes these little stainless rods. So we'll take and tumble these overnight. So it's pretty simple. Cold water up to about 1 inch from the top. Put a little, actually let's start here. So a little Dawn dish soap, about 3 or 4 drops. Perfect, because you don't want to generate a whole bunch of bubbles, because that bubbles is pressure, so it'll start to leak. And then a little Lemmy Shine so it doesn't have any spots on it when it comes out. Normally, I just set this up on here and let it run, but since I'm going to let it run overnight, I found that it could be a very good idea to leave it on the floor. Because, well, it tends to work better that way. Just in case it has a little bit extra vibration you're not expecting. It doesn't have nearly as far to fall when it's already on the floor. Tech tip.
Should I ask how you know?
You could ask how I know, but I think you'll figure that out. I think that's pretty obvious. So, I guess onto the heads. We have our heads back from paint, and as you will see, Ben took a very large chunk of time, I won't say how much of the day, well, I'm sorry, all of yesterday, to pull the tape off and do the dancing spring bit, and you'll really enjoy it at the end of the day. So that's that. Now, I've also went through and finished prepping these for assembly. basically chased the threads and made sure there's no paint that got into anything where it shouldn't have been. And then just the general thread chasing as far as, you know, like you get a little bit of rust in the threads after you wash them. Not a big deal. So I'm at the point where I need to start assembling things. But in the build process, what you want to know is this spring height. And we've talked about it in the past. So basically you have your spring that goes onto the seat into the cast iron head. And then you have a retainer that comes on top of that and holds it together, of course, with a valve spring and a keeper. You have what's referred to as seat pressure. So what that is how much pressure is put onto the valve seat to close them. Now, that seat pressure is relative to the cam. So the cam drives the spring. So I talked to Ken at Delta Camshafts where we had our camshaft ground, and he recommends anywhere from 60 to 80 on a stock ground, or at least in our condition, a stock ground camshaft. So I'm gonna target that 65 to 70 range, and I'll show you how I get there. But so my point is camshaft drives the spring, and then that height that I'm trying to set up now is relative to the spring. So it's kind of a weird little circle there that we go through, but that's the thought process. So the first thing I'm going to do is take my springs, and I'm going to use a spring tester to determine what the seat pressure will be at what height. Now, we'll do it this way. All right, so take your spring, set it in on this test pad, and basically just crank her down to my height. And I've already zeroed it and all that type of stuff. But, so I'm gonna run this down, and I'm gonna watch since I don't know what height I want, or what the stock one is, I'm gonna roll this down till I get 60 pounds of seat pressure. So right there, and it's gonna move around a little bit, but, so we're at 60 pounds, and that gives me a 1.96. So I'll take and write that down. I've already done this once, obviously. So 196. Now I'm also going to bring this to 70 just to give myself a range. Okay, and that's 196 to 192. So let's scribble that on a piece of paper. So 60 pounds is 1.96, 70 is 1.92. So that's a 40 thousandths range as far as my height. So what I'll do is I take my valve, put it up through the guide in the head, okay? And then I'll bring my micrometer in here normally, and then my guide. Now the first problem I run into is my guide, or I'm sorry, the retainer style is a little bit different than we're used to. So typically that retainer is only what I'm showing you above my thumb. And it always sits in here flush with this micrometer. So I'm not gonna be able to use the standard micrometer first off. So we're just gonna set that aside. And now I'm gonna use this guide, put this in here, use my keepers, just like normal, but my micrometer is not going to be in the way. Okay. Now, the height I'm looking for is from this seat to this seat, so top and bottom of the pocket. And I'm going to have to go about this a little bit different. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to use my dial calipers, which again is not what you typically do, but with a little bit of patience and control, you can handle it. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is come in here and I'm going to zero out my calipers on the thickness of the retainer. Okay, what that's going to do then, because I'm going to end up measuring from here down to here, so I'm not guessing where this ledge is at. Basically let the micrometers do the work from that zeroing function takes that off of there. So now I'm just going to come down ever so carefully and basically do a height gauge. So my spring pocket is 1.939. Okay, so I'm a thou under my I'm a thou under 9, call it 940. So I'm at 1 inch 940. So that's dead center of that range that I was talking about, that I measured already on that spring. So measuring the pocket without any kind of shim in there, I'm at 1.940. So it lays pretty nicely within my two ranges that I set up already. Now I'm just going to make the decision of what I want that gap to be. And obviously I want to put, if I put any amount of shim, I'm going to shorten this up. So I'm going to be closer to my 70 number from a load standpoint, which is not a big deal. So now what I'll do is go in and take a shim. I got them all together here, but I'll take a shim, drop it in there, remeasure it, right? And then say, okay, well, I'm going to put every one of them at the exact same height. Based on what I'm seeing right now, I'm probably going to throw a 10,000 shim in there. That'll put me at a pocket of 1.93. And then my load, and I'll verify it obviously on the spring tester, that'll put my load probably around 68 pounds for seat pressure. Now, on the other side of that seat pressure is your opening or your fully open valve pressure. And you don't want to get too high there to where the point where you're putting too much pressure on there, but that's where the spring range is. And I already measured that out, and I'll be about 160, which is pretty good for the RPM that this motor will spin. Now, the last decision here in our assembly is deciding which style of valve stem seals we're going to use. So, from the factory, as Cadillac put these out in 1957, this is the retainer, and the seal was just a rubber, think of it as a round cylinder that pressed into here, and it was retained by the outside of this retainer, or the inside of the retainer, and then of course it had a hole for the valve stem, and it's just a umbrella seal. So it would sit on here, it would seal, technically not anything, it seals above or holds on to the valve stem way up here, and it has an umbrella function to where it drips around the guide so it doesn't get directly here into that clearance. So a little more modern umbrella seal is like this little rubber one here. It's nice and squishy, right? But it has that umbrella function. So we put that on, function wise, it would look like this. And you can see it's not tight around the guide. It's just there. So as the valve moves up and down, the seal goes with the valve. Again, you have this umbrella style, and then what we typically use most commonly is this positive seal. And the idea is it actually seals, you can see inside of here has some ribs on it. Whoop, let me throw it around. It will seal on the guide. And then of course it'll also seal to the valve stem, and it creates a positive seal. So it's not a dripper or an umbrella, it is a true seal as far as the valve stem is concerned. The issue with that, in our case right now, or to utilize that positive seal, you need to take a cutter and have the appropriate size arbor, but a cutter that would come down here and it would change this OD to accept whatever seal size you're using. Relative to what this engine is going to see and what we need it to do, we're going to stick with the stock setup, which was an umbrella seal. Now, like I said initially, Cadillac came out with a rubber plug basically that went into this hole and was retained here. What they superseded it with in the aftermarket was this plastic piece that is basically pushed onto a shorter retainer and that has some grooves way down inside of that. So we're going to use that. It goes onto there. We don't have to worry about it's not going to hit the guide here, and it'll push on push on as such. I can put my keepers in there and then pull it up, obviously with the spring in here, and then that's our assembly. Now I know that was a lot to chew on, and trust me, I've been chewing on it for about 2-3 hours today trying to decide what the best way to go about this, and I've made a couple phone calls to some other people and said, hey, what do you think, and put together all that recommendation and said, this is the best for my situation, just like you're gonna have to do on whatever you're building. So at the end of the day, we're using the stock side of things and know that we're gonna have, what it was, and it'll be fine. Then from that, it's pretty straightforward as far as going through, measuring all of our spring heights, shimming as it's needed, and then we'll go through all of our assembly process where we put the spring in with the compressor, and then put our guide with the seal built in, and then our keepers, and away we rip. It's as simple as that. Well, here we are. Heads are assembled. Valve springs are in. Obviously the valves are in. These two heads are done. So that's going to wrap up the head assembly for right now until they're on the motor, which will be kind of in the next time here. But right now, to finish out my day, I got to run over and get that fuel pump out of the tumbler and finish up that assembly. So that's where I'm off to now. Bubble some of the black gook off. And all I'm really doing is trying to get all the little steelies off of it. Well, here's our parts out of the tumbler. Picked out all the little posts, well, except for those two, but we're looking good. So let's get this assembled. We have our short block is completed, and today I'm going to get the heads, the rocker shafts on, and basically complete the top end of the motor. All the way from the intake down to the pan will be complete, and then we can move on and get it started up on the test stand. So that's what we're doing today. I'm starting off with getting our shaft rocker assemblies assembled. So then as I put the heads on, I can utilize the rocker stands are also one of the head bolts. So We got to have that all together so we can lock the heads down to the top of the block. And with that, roll tape. Bam! Done. Just so you don't make a mistake here, like, well, I almost did. On your threads going into your cylinder heads, you want your ARP lube on the head and underneath the head and the washer of the bolt, but don't put it on the threads because you need to seal the thread into the water jacket because these are not blind holes. They go into the water jacket. So use a little Teflon. That gives you plenty of lubrication anyway, and you won't spring a leak when you put water in it. At this point, we have our push rods and our lifters in. Now, the order was a little bit different than we typically would do because the shaft rockers on this are also utilize the head bolts. So the key is going to be now, so everything's not torqued down like I normally would. So I go through and, here's my torque sequence, and I'm going to torque everything down to 70. And of course, I'm also going to increment that up. So I'm going to run around the head 3 times, and I'm going to do 30, 50, 70, basically a nice even progression. But what my point is when I go to set these down on here, I got to be real careful that I get all my push rods lined up and into the rockers. And then of course, I'll bring my bolts down in here and torque them down and bring everything down evenly. It's going to load the springs. It's a little bit different than normal. Usually the rocker arms are a separate function. So, and how this is done, that's the way it is. A little different. And 17. Excellent. All right, that torques down the left side cylinder head and all the valve train all at once. So valve lash is going to be really easy because valve lash doesn't need to be set because it is set based on basically torquing the shaft down, and you cross your fingers, I guess, and make sure everything else is correct. So we didn't change any of that. So our lash should be good as far as how much the hydraulic lifters are set. Let's get this rolled over and get the other side done. Heads are on, the rocker shafts are bolted down, the heads are torqued. I snuck the dipstick in when nobody was looking. So that's done. And at this point, I want to put the valley cover on, but I also have some miscellaneous fittings and some things that need to go on here. So that comes back to a very good point of, remember all those pictures you take as you tear it down? Well, I've been going back and forth referencing what what fitting what in what spot, and of course what orientation it is in. So a good for instance is this tube here. I don't have it cleaned up yet, I don't have it cleaned up yet, but I got looking at this and I'm like, what is this for and where does it go? Well, there's a little hole down here in the side, and if you remember we were talking about the oil pump and the fact that it has a vacuum pump attached to it. Well, this is our wiper line. So it's going to come up in here, and that's going to supply vacuum up to the top so we can hook our windshield wipers up. So that's what that is for. But again, I got looking around, I'm like, I don't see where this is at, but I flipped through my pictures. I could see this tube hanging up there, and then it's like, oh yeah, that's right. So that's that piece. Now, something to note as I go through and put the seal down for the valley cover, I'm going to use sealant against the cover. Whoop. Okay, so I'm going to use some Right Stuff in between here, and it's going to seal it to the cover, but I'm not going to worry about putting sealant here for now. That way, if I need to come in and inspect something later on, it's a little easier to come on and off. Well, that's our course of action, and I guess roll the time lapse. Put some Right Stuff on it. So here we are. We have our valley covers on, our intake manifold is on. Now I'm going to move on to the front end, and I'm going to put the water pump on, the pulleys, and then come back up and put the fuel pump on, and then of course the thermostat housing last. Now, a little spoiler alert, sorry. When you go to watch the time lapse, you're probably going to pick out that I forgot to put the fuel pump rod in the hole before I put this stand on. So again, sorry to spoil that for you, but we remedied that. It's not a big deal. Pulled the 2 bolts out before the sealer was set up. Pulled it up, slipped it in, and it's all good to go. So moving forward, let's get this side of it done, and we're just that much closer. Oh, there is it. There. These are the hoses, the cooling hoses that go back to the transmission. So it utilizes the water line from the engine coolant. It's kind of the opposite of what that normally is. So instead of bringing the transmission fluid forward, they're taking the engine coolant backward. So I'm taking advantage of the space here to put my hoses on now and then just pull them back through, opposed to trying to fight around all the other stuff. That's the theory here. Hopefully it works out nicely. we're moving on now to putting our exhaust manifolds on and our valve covers. And then we're going to put up this huge external oil filter. So we'll get that done. And then, of course, the distributor while we're back here in this corner. But as you can see, we have our exhaust manifolds in here, and they are looking really, really nice. And when we get over to the other side here, actually, let me grab this. So here's our other side. And if you remember, this side had a little boo-boo on it. It had the crack that went up to the side of it. Now I went through and I attempted to do a repair as far as TIG welding it shut. Went through a lot of gyration as far as materials and all that sort of stuff. And quite frankly, this cast iron is just dirty. So it was not going to weld that way. So I went more of a traditional route and just brazed it all together and then cleaned it all up, and it looks pretty decent. And of course, our exhaust manifolds have the beautiful Cerakote on here from West Michigan Cerakote. This is considered this is not I think it's the titanium, but I always just call it the dark gray, and Drew corrects me every time and I never remember. So I appreciate his patience with me and the fact that he whacked these things out really fast. And I promise next time I'll give you a little more lead time, Drew. Thank you. All right, let's get that over here out of the way, and let's move forward. Okay, before I kind of goop up this side, as far as the seal is concerned, and get my gasket on, something I'm not sure if you caught on the other side when we put it on, but we had Mike Dunkley come over and do some hand painting on our Cadillac. So this is hand painted with that horsehair brush, and just gorgeous. Does a very nice job. But it's on top of that embossment, and it really touches it. It really sets it off that way. Here we are, final push before it goes on the engine stand. Get my coil on, gonna get our Sean Murphy carburetor put on here. It's nice and cleaned up and absolutely gorgeous. And then the air cleaner, that's also gorgeous. We'll get our fan on the front and send it out the door onto the engine stand. So here we go. Well, folks, here it is. This is our 1957 Cadillac 365 cubic inch engine of glory, and its majestic dark royal blue paint, and our Cerakoted exhaust manifolds, our wonderful hidden underneath here Sean Murphy carburetor, and it is ready to go onto the engine stand. However, we've made a decision. Based on our last time, there were some folks that were not as pleasantly happy about the surprise of, whoops, we're not going to start it now, and did it later. So to appease that, we're not going to start it today and we're not going to put it on the engine stand today. But it will be in the time lapse, which is right around the corner, trust me. So until then, get out in the shop, get your stuff done, and eagerly anticipate the time lapse. See ya.